Welcome back to the last video in our Ascot Quilt Along. In today's video I'm going to show you how to do the sashing and the borders. I'd like to say thank you to Brenda. She runs a YouTube channel called Conquering Mount Scrapmore, and she did a shout out to me a couple of weeks ago and asked some of her followers to pop over to see me. I'll put a link to her YouTube video in my description below, so please do the same and pop along and say hi from Jayne. So to finish your quilt top, you're going to need to frame your quilt blocks to make them all the same size, and then add your sashings and borders. And in this video I'll show you how to do just that. Framing strips or coping strips are used to make all your blocks in the same size before you add your sashing. In this block, the light blue fabric. The size of your strips for the blocks will be dependent on your own blocks. Please refer to the grid in the comments section of this video or the PDF on my website for measurements. For the sashing fabric, you're going to need 12 2.5 inch strips by the width of your block, and 3 2.5 inch strips by the width of your quilt top, and 3 2.5 inch strips by the length of your quilt top. And you're going to need 4 2.5 by 2.5 inch squares for the cornerstones. And for the border fabric, you're going to need 8 4.5 inch by 42 inch strips. And for the binding fabric, you need to measure the top and sides of your quilt. Add these together, then multiply by 2. Divide this number by 42, width of fabric, round up the result to the nearest whole figure and multiply by the width you have chosen for your binding. Buy this amount of fabric and cut into strips of your chosen width. So, welcome back to the last week of the Ascot Quilt Along. In today's video we're going to be putting the sashing and the borders onto the quilt. So the first thing we're going to do is have a look at all of the blocks and trim them where necessary. So the blocks should measure 12.5 by 12.5. So just grab this ruler, and this ruler is exactly 12.5 by 12.5. In places it's not totally perfect, so I need to trim the sides down, making sure that I leave my 1/4 inch points in places. So I've got my long ruler and I need to find my rotary cut. So what I like to do is I find, in this case, the point here, and I line the edge of the ruler against that with a 1/4 inch seam, 1/4 inch line on that point, and I have a look to see if that is a straight edge. So I'm going to line the 1/4 inch of the ruler on here, and then along here I'm going to make sure that that is straight also. And then I'm going to have a look at the sides. So I think down this side here I trim a little bit off. I'm going to rotate all the way around, doing each side. So I'm going to repeat that with all of the blocks. Now the granny square one is a little bit bigger than all the others, but at the moment I'm just going to maintain that 1/4 inch seam allowance. from the points. Okay, so I'm just going to tidy up. And then put these back to one side. So I've measured all of my blocks, and they're not all 12.5 by 12.5. And of course the Granny's square block is bigger, and we know that that was going to be bigger. So in order to make them all the same size, we have to add frames to these blocks before we can add the sashing. These frames are sometimes known as coping strips or framing strips. So some of my blocks were square, and some of my blocks were maybe 12.25 inches in one direction and 12 3/8 in the other direction. So for those ones, I'm going to cut 2 coping strips or framing strips that are 12.5 inches by 1.25 inches. I'm just going to cut 2 of those, and they'll go either side, and then I'm going to trim them, and then I'm going to cut 2 more to go the other side, and then these are going to finish at 14 inches. So I'm going to use this light blue fabric for the coping strips, and I'm going to need to cut 16 strips that are 12.5 inches by 1.25 inches, and 2 strips that are 12 3/4 inches by 1 1/8 inch strip. So I'm going to straighten this edge, and then I'm going to cut 5 strips that are 1 1/4 inches wide. So now I'm going to subcut these strips into, I need 16 that are 12.5 inches long. So the first thing I'm going to do, cut the selvage edges off. Now I can see that that one hasn't cut very well. It wasn't lined up nicely, so I'm just going to put that one to one side, and might use a little bit of that later. So let's get the next one. It should be better cut. So I'm going to leave it folded in half, and then that means I'll be cutting 2 strips at a time. So I'm going to use this ruler and line up 12.5 inches. So that's 2. And then I'm going to open this one out and cut another 12.5 inches. So from each strip you're going to get 3 12.5 inches. I need 16 in total. So that's 12. I'm going to go back to this one that wasn't cut perfectly. You can see here it's a little bit shy. So I'm going to open this one out and then cut from this end, which is the correct 1 1/4 inches. where it went a little bit shy, and I do need two that are 1 1/8. So I'm just going to see, that is 1 1/8 at that end. So that's, I'm going to cut this one at 12 3/4. So this is for the granny squares block. I'm just going to put that to one side, and I was wrong. I needed to cut 6 widths from this, so let's just cut another one. So this needs to be 1 1/4 inches. So I'm going to cut 2 more at 12 1/2. Now that should be 16, so I've got 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. So I've got 16 for most of my blocks. Now this one needs to be cut at 12 3/4. And then it needs to be trimmed to 1 1/8. It's actually quite wibbly where it was on where the piece of fabric was folded on the bolt. So I'm just going to cut that side, and I'm going to turn it round and trim the other side as well. Very wibbly indeed. Okay, so that's pretty good. I'm just going to get rid of all the rubbish into my little pot. So these are for the granny square, and the rest are for the others. So I'm now going to pin one of these onto one edge and the other one onto the opposite edge. So these have been cut very precisely, and so they do need to fit on the block precisely. And when I take them to the sewing machine, I will sew this way up so I can see where the points are on the block. Now clearly I've cut those ones too short, so I'm going to have to cut that one again. Just put that to one side. And then these are the longer ones that I cut, longer but slightly narrower, that go onto the granny square. Because I wasn't sure that I would have enough of the light blue fabric for the borders, if I cut another strip, I just joined together some of those offcuts to make one piece, well, 2 pieces that were long enough. Joined them with a mitered join, and I'm going to pin these onto the top and bottom of this block. So I'm going to take these over to the sewing machine and sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So back at the pressing mat, I'm going to set the seams and press towards the framing strips. So now that those are pressed, I need to cut 6 strips that are 1 1/4 inches wide. And then I need to subcut these into 14-inch strips. Just like before, I'm going to cut the selvages off, leaving them folded in half. I'm going to cut 14-inch strip first. That will give me 2 strips. When I unfold this one, I need to trim that to 14 inches. Now 2 of these need to be cut to 1 1/8 inch wide for the granny squares block. So we're just going to repeat the process by pinning and sewing these strips onto the blocks. So I've pressed the blocks and now I've laid them on my bigger cutting mat, and I've got my bigger ruler, and I'm lining the center point of the block at 7 inches in both directions, so that I can trim the sides to 14 inches. So some areas are a little bigger than 14 and other a little smaller than 14. But once I've done this in all on all blocks, I'm going to make a decision as to whether I cut them a little bit smaller. Okay, so having done the first trim to 14, I think I could probably make them a little bit smaller to make sure that they're all the same. So now it's a question of working out how much smaller do I want to make them. So I've decided to trim the blocks to 13.5 inches, which means the center point is 6 3/4, and I've marked the center point here at 6 3/4, and then I've extended the masking tape so that I should be able to see the points on the blocks below. So that's lined up, and I'm just going to check that I've still got 13.5 at the top and all the way round. So I think that's going to be okay. It does mean that the coping strips are going to be quite small, so by cutting these back, I'm going to be left with about 3/4 inch, and once that's sewn into the block, into the sashing, I will have about 1/2 inch strips. The only one I'm worried about actually is the granny square, so let me grab that one. Yep, that's still going to work as well. So the coping strips will be pretty narrow, but at least all the blocks will be the same size. So now that all the blocks have been made the same size, we now need to work out which of them need to have the sashing strips. When I originally worked out the fabrics that you needed for this quilt, I didn't take into account that we were going to need to frame our blocks before we could do the sashing. So I actually don't have enough of the fabric that I ordered and had designed for. So I'm going to make a few changes to the look of the quilt. So I don't have enough of the light blue fabric to do the borders, but in my stash I have a dark blue fabric that I do have enough of for the borders. So as in true patchwork style, I am going to, using the fabrics that I've got, I'm going to complete the quilt, and it will look a little different, but the techniques and the processes are the same. So from this dark blue fabric, I have cut the sashing strips. These have been cut at 2.5 inches wide and 14 inches long, and I have cut 12 of these. And I've looked at the design of the quilt, and I've identified the 6 blocks that need to have these sashing strips stitched to the bottom of. So I'm going to pin those and then stitch them. Now I have cut these sashing strips a little bit longer than they need to be, so that I can trim them down to the correct size once they're sewn on. So I'm going to take these over to the sewing machine and sew with a 1/4 inch seam. So back at the pressing mat, I'm going to set the seams and press towards the sashing strip. And now I'm going to trim the sashing strips. So now I'm going to refer back to the quilt diagram and see which block joins which block. So in the diagram, this block joins this block. So I'm going to place these right sides together and join them at the sashing strip side. So I'm going to repeat that with the other 2 pairs. So now I'm going to take these over to the sewing machine and sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'm now going to set the seams and press towards the sashing strip. I'm now going to refer back to the quilt diagram and place the bottom block on the bottom of these strips. So underneath the card trick, we have this block here. So I'm going to pin these together and then take them to the sewing machine and sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So again, I'm going to set the seam and I'm going to press it towards the sashing strip. And then I'm going to set these to one side. So now we're going to sew the sashing strips to the cornerstones. We're only going to need 4 cornerstones. So I'm placing them right sides together along that short edge. So the cornerstones are 2.5 inch squares. So I'm going to take those over to the sewing machine and sew with a 1/4 inch seam. Now I'm going to join these two together, and I'm going to join these two together. So what we've got is a blue, white, blue, white, and then we'll finish it off with the blue on the other end. So now I'm going to join another blue strip to this cornerstone here. And repeat on the other strip. So back at the pressing mat, I'm going to set the seams and press towards the sashing strip. So now I'm going to grab the centre strip, which is the one with the card trick in it. So I'm going to give this a press, and then I'm going to pin those strips on both sides of this strip of blocks. So because we've pressed towards the sashing strips, these should lock together. So I'm going to lock those seams together and pin them, and then pin down the side here. And I'm going to repeat that on the other side and then take it over to the sewing machine. So back of the pressing mat, I'm going to set the seams and press towards the sashing strips. And now I'm going to pin the other 2 block strips to each side of this centre piece. So I've measured the quilt top in the centre from one edge to the other edge across the centre in both directions, and it measures 44 inches. So I'm going to cut 2 strips that are 44 inches by 2.5 inches off this fabric. So I'm going to start by straightening the edge, and I'm going to turn it round, and now I'm going to cut 2 2.5 inch strips. So I'm not going to cut the selvages off, but I will give them a press, and then I'm going to pin them to the top and bottom of the quilt top. It's just not quite long enough. I may have to join it. I really didn't want to join it, but I think I'm going to have to. I've just put the quilt top to one side. So to join it, I need to grab that other strip, and I'm going to join it with a mitered corner. And you can see the selvages are here and here, so I'm going to make sure we're not going to use those. I'm going to sew from here down to here. So I'm going to pop a pin in this side and one on this side, and take that to the sewing machine and sew a diagonal seam. So back at the cutting board, I'm just going to cut 1/4 inch away from that sewn line. And then we're going to press that seam open. So I'm going to have to cut another strip 2.5 inches wide for the bottom, but I'll be able to use part of this strip that I've just joined here, because we only need a few inches of it. Just pop this to one side and grab the quilt top. So I don't want to put this mitered edge right at the edge of the quilt. I'll probably put it just part way along that 3rd column, and then I've still got quite a lot of this left over to join onto the bottom strip. So I'll pin these again. So I'm going to take that over to the sewing machine and sew with a 1/4 inch seam. So I'm going to set the seam and then I'm going to press it towards the sashing strip. And now I'm going to trim that sashing strip. So I'm going to keep that longer piece for the bottom sashing piece. And then this is a slightly shorter piece, I'll just keep it for the time being. So I need to cut some more sashing strips off my fabric. I'm going to need 2 for the bottom and 1 each for the side, and hopefully I'll have some leftovers. So I'm just going to cut 3 more strips that are 2.5 inches wide. I'm now going to pin that shorter one to the bottom of the quilt top. So once again, I want that mitered join to be on the 3rd column. So I'm going to place it around about there. I don't want it too close to the edge. I'll start by pinning this here. So I'm now going to take that back over to the sewing machine and sew this piece of sashing onto the quilt top. So once again, I'm going to set and press the seams. And now I'm going to trim. So now we're ready to put the side strips on. Once again, I want that mitered join to be on the 3rd block. So I'm going to continue with the same process to put the side pieces on. So after sewing and trimming the sashing pieces, the quilt top now looks like this. So as you know, I've run out of fabric for the border and I need to order some more of that in. But adding the border is really simple. It's just like adding those final sashing strips. So you're going to need to cut 8 strips, 4.5 by 42 inches wide, join them together in pairs, sew them onto the top and bottom and then trim, and sew them onto the sides and then trim, and then you're all done. Congratulations, you have made the Ascot quilt. Thank you very much for joining in my quilt along, and please post pictures of your finished quilt at #AscotQAL on Instagram. Bye for now and happy quilting!